All right, well, welcome everyone to our medical device and diagnostics panel. I'm thrilled to have all of you here, and even more thrilled to have all of you here, and thank you so much for coming today. What do you think of the conference so far? Yeah, good? Oh, good. We have a number of students, Sri being one of them, Sri Mullencandy, who was a core part of the team, and seriously, the students put this all together. So I think they deserve, Sri in this instance deserves a round of applause. How's that for putting you on the spot? Good. All right, well, I'm going to just briefly introduce our speakers, our panelists today. The way I'm going to do this is I have some general questions that I want to ask, and then I also have a question for each person. I told them that they don't need to feel like they have to answer every question because sometimes that can get tedious, but those of you who have a lot of passion, a lot of energy around a question should feel free. If these chairs are uncomfortable, feel free to get up, walk around, lean against it, whatever you like. So on my right is Ladin, right? Yes. And he's a principal at Medtech Advisors, which is a consulting firm that many of you, I'm sure, have heard of. Ivan is, to his right, Alvin Salgo is an MD, MBA, and Associate Chief Medical Officer at Philips Patient Care and Monitoring Solutions. That's a mouthful. That kind of goes along with all your degrees, I think.
It's easier to say PCMS.
And next to him is Kevin Hruvorsky. Did I get it sort of close? Hruvorsky. Who is the CEO and Executive Chairman of Quanterix. And next to him is Jacques Coumans. Is that right? Okay. VP and Chief Marketing and Scientific Officer at Analogic Corporation, where Sri actually did his internship. And David Fisher is on the right. He's VP of Healthcare Policy and Strategy at Siemens Healthcare. So we have a rather impressive panel here. And I thought that I'd start, and I think I'm going to kind of perch here if I'm not. Am I in your way?
Yeah.
Okay. That way I can see you as well. So I'm going to start with a general question for the panel, kind of a broader one, which is, can each of you identify the top one or two challenges or issues facing the device or diagnostics arena or your company in particular? Basically, what's keeping your C-suite folks up at night? And David, do you want to start?
So I think the way I'd answer that is that there's incredible pressure in the healthcare space to do more with less. And as a manufacturer of capital equipment, our company is optimized for fee-for-service and for doing more with more. And so we have to figure out a way to match this change in the healthcare system that's coming in the United States.
Hey, John?
Two trends that I would highlight is the need for evidence-based medicine, which has a direct effect on how we as manufacturers look at the equipment that we produce. It's not just features and technology per se, it is really the proof points that you have to generate before you put products in the marketplace. And the second major trend is the deployment of electronic medical records. So how we capture our data. If you go to a dentist in San Diego and then you relocate to Boston, the first thing he does is get the x-rays done again. And in a way, that's the same for patients in different departments. So having deployed electronic medical records that are trustworthy has an immediate consequence for us as vendors of medical equipment as well, because it means we have to think through how our equipment integrates with those deployed structures. So those are two of the trends I would have.
And just a question for your first one around evidence-based medicine. Can you give an example of how that affects Analogic specifically?
Sure. So I'll give you an example. You asked me, I asked you, could I bring a prop?
Yes, I asked them if they wanted to, they could bring a show and tell.
That is a prop. So this is a hand.
I would have brought a CT machine.
So this is a handheld ultrasound device, battery operated. You switch it on. It is really a sonic window into the body. So if you want to look for vessels in your underarm, you can do that. This helps cannulation. This helps PICC lines. And although this is fascinating technology, it's, if you will, an iPhone with an additional detector attached to it. Still, the medical community at large wants to know the fascinating technology, but give us proof that this saves dollars, this improves access, or improves the quality of care. So the industry, in this particular case, Analogic, cannot just go to market and say, this is fascinating technology. You have to give proof to the medical community that in 3 areas, or at least one of the 3, quality of care, quality of access, and quality of reduction of cost, you actually play a role with deploying this technology.
Great example, thank you. Kevin?
First of all, it's great to be here, and I think that that's a pretty good answer. This whole area of health is something that we've watched very carefully, and it seems like the more you can get into understanding the disease before you have symptoms is kind of the big trend. So to the extent that you can understand the disease long before you present symptoms is a lot of what our technology is trying to focus in on. And then once you have technologies that can do that, then how do you get it to the patient quickly? It takes 10 years typically to go through all the regulatory and all of the different funding routes. And so how do you get exposure is another critical area. And so from the technology standpoint, having a lot of scientific journal articles and things that can showcase to people that your technology can see symptoms of heart disease or cancer or even concussions before you have symptoms of them. That is one area. But then once you have that, how do you get good exposure? And many times you have to go to the advocacy groups. You got to go to the people that are suffering the most and get them to kind of really raise up. So right now we can measure concussions in blood. And even in sweat, we can measure concussions, which will change potentially the NFL and a lot of different sporting events where it's a big trauma right now. But how you get those groups involved, so now we've got a lot of NFL players and a lot of NFL owners, the crafts owners that are really talking about this, and that then helps push the science forward because now you have people really want to pull it forward. And so I think it's the combination of having the technology and the science that proves the technology, but then how do you get it exposed in a way that you really can pull it along so that it doesn't take 10 years for the patient to benefit from it.
And that's an interesting point about patient advocates, those groups, getting them on board as well.
I mean, there's so many suicides going on right now. Former NFL players, former hockey players, even Pop Warner Sports. There's kids committing the tackle from Ohio State University last year committed, all concussion related. And so once these major institutions understand the role of concussion, the role of CT, which by the way, Boston University is a leader in this whole area. Bob Stearns, I was with him yesterday, and he's going to be on 60 Minutes next week. But the ability to get that information out and then have those people pull it forward, I think is one of the biggest issues that we have. It just takes so long.
Ivan?
So yes, for 2 points. I would think about 2 points in 2 areas. One is the economics of healthcare. So what keeps executives up at Philips at night are that the reimbursement landscape and the way healthcare is delivered from an economic standpoint is changing very quickly now. And when you're actually planning a business, and you actually have to create a business plan, and you have to plan out 2-3 years, you have to be, or more, 5 years, you have to be careful that you're not going after moving targets, because if you want to deliver innovation, obviously you want to have a business model behind it that's successful when it launches. From a medical viewpoint, I would say that there's much more chronic disease now than there was, because the good news is we can get folks with chronic heart disease, with cancer, they're surviving longer, but now they have actually much more complex medical problems. So if I were to wrap that up into something, the economics and the medical, I would say that we're going to move and transition from event-based care to a holistic care that basically where the care is now delivered around the patient instead of the patient is delivers themselves around the healthcare system. A quick example is if you think of a patient who's got 4 or 5 medical conditions and has about 6 or 7 medical subspecialists, and you heard that downstairs, for example, at Children's, they can have 10 or more subspecialists, it just becomes a nightmare to try to organize that care. And so actually now having systems which organize the care on the patient, I think, is another transition that's going to come.
Great, thanks. Steve.
I think that what we face quite often is the new entrepreneurs, typically technologists that have an idea about something that could solve a critical issue or a critical problem. And the challenge that they have to meet is that the horizon for getting that adopted in a medical practice keeps getting farther and farther along and keeps getting more expensive. So how to get the funding necessary, which means how to get the investors long-term interest in the development, the continued development, and the clinical testing and all the necessary regulatory hurdles that one needs to successfully overcome, that is what keeps most of them awake.
I was just at a conference last week on medical devices, and they were saying that Medtech revenue is not growing substantially, it's in the low single digits, and that there seems to be a dwindling interest from venture funds. Is that accurate? Is that all your experience?
First of all, I think that's an incredibly important answer to the investors, and we spent a lot of time firing them up, because if you don't fire them up, you really can't push it forward. And I would say that there's a real surge right now in the VCs that I'm dealing with in the area of immune system cancer drugs. And so there's certain categories in this one firm that I'm working with, their companies that they own have increased $18 billion their value in the last 18 months. So it's amazing to me, in certain corridors, these VCs are going extremely well. But there are other corridors, and you mentioned specifically device. Most of what they were doing is therapeutics. And I think that there's this back and forth that occurs, and I do think that therapeutics seem to have a lot of firepower right now, and devices don't have quite as much.
Yeah, I think it depends on the part of the market you're looking at. If you're talking about inpatient healthcare, it's declining, right? Or at least growing very, very slowly. Therapeutics tends not to have some of the same challenges with policymakers, for example, that Diagnostics does. But then on the other hand, you see a company like Theranos, though they've had a bad couple of weeks, valued at $9 billion, and they haven't ever sold anything. So I think you have a real mix. There's a real mix out there from that perspective.
Yeah, and the mix is, as the panel is describing, is probably shift from one areas in terms of what VCs are investing into other areas, and that is to say, probably moving from traditional care areas to how care can be delivered either more effectively or less invasively. So some focused areas in med device that have been doing well over the last few years are delivering devices where one doesn't have to have an operation, but you can actually have an implantable delivered. It reduces the length of stay, infectious complications, blood transfusions. So I would say that the excitement is around new ways of delivering care, but at lower cost. And then the interesting question is, if you lower cost, what do you do with outcome? Does the outcome have to be better? Is it the same? Is it okay if the outcome isn't as good because it costs less? And there's some real challenges there. But I've also heard as well that in the oncology and immuno-oncology, that's where VCs are definitely putting a lot of focus.
Good. Okay, another question. And this, what you're talking about sort of leads into this, is that there are major ecosystem changes. You all talked about that when I talked with you earlier in the past couple of weeks. Health systems are consolidating, ever-increasing focus on reduction of costs and changes in regulatory requirements. How is that impacting you and your organization?
If I may, two aspects to be highlighted. Traditional equipment companies make their monies on two sides of the equation usually, selling equipment and servicing equipment. But in China, people are essentially unwilling to sign up for service contracts because in hospital service contracts compete with salaries of staff members. So, industry in China is forced to confront to sell equipment with maybe 5 or 7 years of warranty. So that completely upsets the intricacies of how you make money in the industry. So one of the areas that Analogic is looking at, we're not only in medical imaging, we're also in the area of threat detection. Our CT scanners are essentially all major airports, and they run 365, 24/7. So they have very high reliability, and therefore the service requirements are a little less than for typical healthcare usage. So there could be paradigm shifts in which these cross-pollinations really help lower the cost of equipment by lowering not just the equipment cost, but also the 5-7 year time service contracts.
Is there a change in equipment as a result? Because I know in India, we went to the GE company in India, and they were making a whole variety of equipment, but it was much simpler, much easier to use, and designed for dusty roads and gaps in electricity and people who weren't as well trained on how to use it.
A little trickier to answer. The rural areas in Africa and China and India have totally different infrastructures. The grid is not reliable, so you have to think about solutions for MRI or for CT that are just different than the Western world or the developed markets where, 80-20 rule doesn't always go. In China, you want sometimes to sell CT systems to departments for thoracic diagnostics, where there are 2 buttons, scan and stop or something like that. No, this whole piano type of user interface. The wish for throughput is so high, people don't even have time to lower the beds of CT scanners and then raise them for the next patient. They just have 2 crates and stairs so that people can just walk up to them, or parents bring their patients, their children to the CT scan. So I think we can learn in the West from what I see happening in India and in China. The 80-20 rule doesn't apply.
Well, an interesting anecdote for Siemens anyway, Siemens imaging products. We manufacture stuff around the world, US, Europe, in China as well. We also sell high-end products, a lot of high-end products here in the US particularly, but also lower-end products that are designed for what we call the M3 market. We sell just as many high-end pieces of equipment in China as we sell here in the US, and we sell more low-end M3 products here than we do in China.
And why is that? Say more of that.
I think that one of the main issues is the U.S. market is viewed as one market when it's not. Another way to think about that, if you live in Fairfax County, Virginia, your average life expectancy is like 88, 90 years, something like that. If you live about 100 miles west of there in West Virginia, it is 15 years less at least. We have very different markets here in the United States compared to just the one that we talk about. We talk about average life expectancy in the U.S. That's you're putting together an average of some places that are the healthiest places in the world and some places that are about as healthy as Russia. And so we have a dollar. That's an indication of how dollars are also mismatched around the country. And I think that's probably at least one reason for why M3 products sell well in parts of the U.S.
Yes, I don't know if you were here for Andrea's talk, but he had a map of Baltimore where his yuppie friends, were getting martinis right here, and then the poorest of the poor were practically across the street.
Yep.
And how do you deliver healthcare?
Yeah, I live on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. Washington Hospital Centers and GW Hospital are both pretty well known. There's one hospital in the southeast, which is a poor part of the city. I don't think I can. I bet nobody here can come up with the name of it. I can't. As opposed to the very famous places here, see in different parts of the city.
Great. And, yeah,
I'll give you two quick examples of, one these guys may not like so much because they're mostly an imaging, the other one they might like a lot. Today, there's about 10 million CAT scans being administered in from emergency room settings, of which the data that we have suggests that there's only 10% positive from the scan itself for head trauma. And that means there's about 9 million scans, CAT scans, that are negative. And so there's a company now with a blood test, and we're trying to work with them with our sensitivity to do a screen before the scan to determine whether or not they can disqualify whether someone needs to have the scan. So it prevents them from getting the radiation, plus it saves a lot of money. The second one is for Alzheimer's, the amyloid beta. There's some tracers now that they have, but they have to create a market for it. And so they need a scan of a blood test scan to try to show that this is a patient that should get this PET scan. And so this is going to create demand for the scan, but it's going to better qualify. So going to the insurers and teaching them those economics has been a big piece, I think, of opening up those opportunities for a lower cost, less invasive test that could be used as a screen for the more expensive, more qualified test.
Yeah, so I think the key trend that I'm seeing, and when I speak with colleagues who are in the C-suites of hospitals, if you go around the United States and cities, hospital or say healthcare is consolidating into very large medical systems, and they're doing that for economies of scale so that they can negotiate better with payers and they can negotiate better with vendors. What's interesting though is they also are getting ready for a transition to population health, and I think the key is that both from a federal government point of view and a private payer point of view, they're like, we want to reduce costs, but with what time lens? In other words, okay, I just want to reduce costs in the hospital. Yeah, but if I do one or two other things, maybe that diabetic patient won't come back for 2 or 3 more hospitalizations. Who's going to pay for that extra care that's looking longitudinally at that diabetic patient, for example, if they have a lot of complications? And I think the payers are having a little bit of indigestion trying to figure out, well, prove to me if I give you a little bit more that you're going to help reduce my long-term costs.
because companies typically don't have that long-term view.
Yep.
And there's a lot of pressure at the moment to cut costs substantially now.
I think that some of the paradigms that we see affecting the entire community is the move towards, this was touched upon today, personalized health on one hand, and the added costs associated with it. And so on one hand, the attempt is to try and tailor the particular both diagnostics as well as therapeutic aspects of caring for a patient to address the individual needs. But on the other hand, that may involve increasing some of the costs associated with proper diagnostics and more specific diagnostics. And that's one of the dilemmas that we see happening.
So since we're kind of on the topic of payer and insurance, what's happening with insurance and the medical device diagnostics world? Things improving, getting worse? Are there any kind of innovative things going on around payers, and what are your challenges with them?
I think that's things even worse. I think that, when I first comment I made today was that there's a tremendous pressure to do more with less. That's not just from governments, that's from payers, other payers as well, insurance. Medicare's a payer, Medicaid's a payer, just like United Healthcare is. And so doing more with less is a constant problem for our customers, which means it's a problem for us as a seller, a manufacturer of capital equipment. When you look at what's going on in the U.S. marketplace, the shift from what the old tried and true, depending on your perspective, I suppose, fee-for-service medicine to value-based care means a huge change for our customers, some of which are tremendously uncomfortable. But again, same thing. If it's impacting our customers, it's impacting us. And so we have to adjust the way that we do business in order to be successful in that new marketplace.
So how are you doing that? David?
Many ways. You know, as we have to, without getting too specific, you have to look at your portfolio. You have to look at the way you sell your portfolio. You have to change who you speak to in a facility. You know, historically, just as an example, we have been successful at academic medical centers by having great relationship with radiologists. That has led to, you know, a great business here in the U.S. in particular. And so, as you look at the future with, someone mentioned a moment ago, consolidated healthcare, where you are dealing with very, very large institutions rather than single hospitals, talking to the radiologist is fine, but that radiologist isn't the person making a decision on what you're going to buy. And so you need to move up the chain in your customer, and you have to have the right products that the CFO and the CEO are going to be interested in, not necessarily the really fancy, cool thing the radiologist likes.
Right, and I think that was the point. Go ahead, 'cause I think
I was
that was the
gonna build
point
on
you were
that. Yeah.
yeah.
So as a ship goes from volume to value, at Philips, obviously, we have to do the same thing. So 20, 30 years ago, the vendor would know the chairman of the department and show them, oh, this is the best image, and it's the most testable, most slices, etc. And yeah, love the image, we're done, we're going to buy the equipment. Now, actually, what I would say is we actually have to go above and below. So obviously, we have to go above to the C-suite because they're actually doing large group purchases. But we also actually, what I say, go below the chairman of the department. And we actually work with the technologists and look at, all right, what impedes your workflow? And so now it's not just about increasing resolution, but it's about reducing knobs, improving GUIs, improving the interface experience for the technologist or the person running and doing the scan, because that's just as important to the CFO as the radiologist. And arguably now, what we hear a lot is, you know, the pictures are good enough, help us with the workflow. And so there's actually interesting shifts in terms of where the thrust is on innovation.
So what that means is for your company, you have to be quick on your feet and agile and redesign yourself on a regular basis, which for smaller companies, I think there are a lot of small companies who can do that piecemeal. For a big company, that's a little more challenging.
Yeah, and so we're actually having to improve, migrating away from sort of waterfall project management, big pieces of hardware, and we're getting better and better and better at innovating on software very quickly. That's really a lot of the capability, or a lot of capability has to be developed.
So your workforce is probably changing some too.
Yes.
Which also means, from our perspective at BU, we need to be aware of your needs so that we can match our students with you, and vice versa. You have to be quick to figure out what resources you need. So what about Analogic? You must be facing some of the same issues.
I think when it comes to designing equipment and thinking about how it's going to be used in diagnostics and therapeutics, I think we as companies become much more involved in the clinical pathways. We were maybe in the past not really informed or conversant with it, but now we do. For example, in the emergency medicine department, we have a portfolio of ultrasound products, and one of the products fits into the emergency medicine department. And it's a war zone in emergency medicine departments. So whereas in the past we might have focused on making sure the right image quality is there, the right functionality, today it is about, can we make sure that the ultrasound images obtained from the patient on the table gets at the right time to the surgeon, so he can come out of his part of the building to really change the pathway that is prescribed for this patient. So that means we have to make a real investment in the infrastructure in which the IT of this ultrasound system fits. And that's relatively new to us as providers of equipment, where we look at the cost, image quality. It's the IT infrastructure, influencing workflow, really evaluating how we can help the hospitals with optimizing the clinical pathways.
So where, kind of general question, where is innovation happening? In the US, globally, what small companies, big companies, where are you seeing the most innovative things happening, and what do they look like?
I think that,
And for each of you, it's your company, right?
from our perspective, in fact, we are kind of a clearinghouse
That's right.
for a variety of manufacturers, we see that the vast majority of breakthrough innovations happens in small companies, by far. That is probably the riskier part of the innovation process. And they raise funds and successfully get to the proof of concept, to the first human testing, human trials. And then typically the larger companies get involved and in one form or another buy out those smaller companies.
Is that a model that
Yeah,
you're all using?
I can build on that. So essentially, this is Clay Christensen, Innovator's Dilemma. So if you haven't read it, read it because you're going to need to know it.
Although it's not right anymore.
Yeah. But the bottom line is large companies are essentially invested in the technologies they've developed over time. And actually, as a business school professor that I had, he said all advantages fleeting, used a lot of biological analogies and said there's a big, slow, fat dinosaur and you've got to move very quickly, and all the little creatures that are evolving are moving quickly around the dinosaur. So what actually, one of the areas that I've migrated in over time at Philips actually is I do look at a lot of startups. And I look at a lot of areas in startups. So I've had to learn, now to your point about what's important for the students, I've had to learn things like investment banking, and I have to learn clinical paradigms, and I have to sort of connect business models with evolution. But for example, we look at a lot of very interesting hotbed of startups just in Israel, for example. So we look at a lot of startups in Israel. Philips opened up a new office in Cambridge near Kendall Square. So we're spending actually lots of time in Silicon Valley. We're spending a lot of time looking at startups because startups don't have the overhead of the historical technology. But it's a double-edged sword because only a fraction of startups make it. But I would say that's my perspective from a big company.
We are still a relatively small company, around 1,500 employees, so not near the league of GE, Siemens, Philips. We therefore consider ourselves pretty innovative, but if you look at where innovation takes place, I completely concur. It's around the globe, it's startups. The big innovation money in the bigger companies oftentimes spend on cost reduction of subsystems, not on adding in functionality or creating new IP towards new diagnostic or therapeutic procedures. So the number of small companies that come to, for instance, Analogic and offer us to collaborate, for instance, with our ultrasound is staggering.
Grace, I comment on this too. I got my MBA and spent 10 years at DuPont General Electric type companies, at DuPont Energy. Then I spent 10 years in middle-sized companies. And then I ultimately, in my last 10, 15 years, have been in really small companies. Now I'm serving on the board of about 4 or 5 small companies and have really been focused on that. And I really believe that my ability to use what I learned in school kept going up as I got smaller because I was able to utilize the more complete package of what you do learn in an MBA program. And when I was at DuPont, it was great. I ran Teflon, which was a big business, and it was a lot of mass.
But you didn't stay.
You just can't get to the same level. And I think with today's internet and the speed of socialization that's occurring, these small companies are at a big advantage. So I actually watch them and I see value creation happening very rapidly at these smaller companies, and they're able to find nice exits very quickly. And you'll find yourself back into a big company, and you'll see that difference. And so I think that you're right that the smaller company offers a lot for particularly folks that are in the MBA program.
Are there particular, I mean, you mentioned Israel, and I know that there appears to be a lot of things going on in Israel. Are there areas of the world that seem to be more innovative than others?
Boston.
Well, that would be
It's
good.
unbelievable.
Yeah. The three I mentioned, right? I think Silicon Valley, Boston, Israel are definitely very significant high-tech areas that we see. I don't know other areas the panel can comment on.
I would add to that Shanghai, Beijing, and Mumbai. I was just a couple months ago at the Chinese Medical Equipment Fair, which is held twice a year. And I have a long background in MRI, so I know the hurdles to get into an MRI program are pretty staggering. And much to my surprise, I walked the show floor and I So 15 Chinese companies that have made a 1.5 Tesla or a 3 Tesla MRI system. Now, I know that 80% will fail, but it is still staggering that out of nowhere, essentially, in the last 2-3 years, this innovation potential is being funded by the government to a certain extent, or by private capital. It's fascinating to see.
Yeah, but actually that reminds me too. So a key thing though is in startups, most startups don't have the ability to get it through what we call competent authority, or I'll use the words FDA or Chinese FDA, CFDA. So having an exit strategy or a strategy is key. A few companies can do it, but understanding it as a business, this is a highly regulated environment, and to get things through requires an extra skill set.
Yeah, one of the questions I had for Zvi was, because you have a strong background with the FDA, what's happening with the FDA, both from kind of the FDA's perspective and then from all of your perspective, regulation, regulatory?
Well, I think that I would point out two major developments. One of them very recent, just a few months ago. It was announced just a few months ago, and the other one has been in place for a few years. The most recent one is the transition to what they refer to as a new medical device evaluation system, which means that if manufacturers were horrified by the need to run clinical trials once or twice per product life cycle, now they will have to run it continuously. And the idea is that the FDA is trying to tie together the electronic medical records, the information coming from the unique device identifier, which now identifies each and every single device, for example, that is implanted in the body, and the information coming from payers, in order to, and that's really a joint venture that ties together patient groups, manufacturers, the FDA, and payers. So all the four stakeholders, in order to try and identify early patterns of failure or success in the life cycle of every medical product. They have just announced it a couple of months ago, and they are going to launch the pilot trials to show the feasibility of that approach within the next couple of years.
So what do you all think of this? David, you look like you have an opinion.
FDA, I mean, if you just look at history, FDA is requiring more data to get to market, and the data has to be developed in a way that is more rigorous. I mean, it's harder and harder to get your products to market. That's a basic fact. I think we don't usually disagree with that on this panel.
And is it necessary?
I think it depends on your perspective.
Yeah.
I think it depends a lot on the product. As a general matter in the imaging space, things are, at least today, generally okay. In the lab space, where we also have a big business, be as positive.
Yeah, I would say the answer is it's Goldilocks, right? It has to be just right. I think the good news is that increasing the outcomes burden and burden for clinical data, and I'm having actually to educate a lot of folks within Philips about being in clinical trials and business plans and so forth are good, because if you're going to go to population health, if you're going to go to outcomes-based medicine, that's helpful. If it's too high, though, and if the friction is too high from the regulatory burden, then what happens is you start to innovate less. And I'm clearly seeing a trend of both medical device and pharma doing clinicals and other economies getting the benefits earlier, sometimes a lot earlier than the United States. So, for example, Edwards and Medtronic that developed the Sapien and the Corval, that was actually flourishing in Europe a long time before the United States. There were people in the U.S. who said, "Oh, I really want that non-invasive device." You'd have to go to Europe for it. So finding that right balance, I think, is the challenge.
Just as an example for Siemens, we had a tomosynthesis product. It's 3D mammography on the market in Europe 5 years ago, and it was finally cleared for market here in the U.S. So probably 4 or 5 months ago.
And if it had been developed in another country?
It was developed in Europe
Oh, okay.
And it was on the market probably.
for 5 years longer. Yeah, it took 5 extra years. Part of that delay was on our end, but still, 5 years additional is a long time for a product that was well recognized in Europe as safe and effective.
And is there much, did you develop it in Europe purposely because it would be faster?
No, but no. However, a lot of it, I think, I'd be interested to hear others on this panel, but in my experience in talking to other medical device manufacturers, it is often more difficult to get products on the market in the United States than it is in Europe.
So does that have implications for where you develop things?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And not just develop, that's the key point, is where you market and where you're going to create a business. So you can even develop it in the United States, but your market may be abroad. So I think that's the distinction and key point. It's not only where the innovation is, but where your market will be.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good point. And what about the device tax? Talk about that a little bit. Is it as bad as
So it's a 2.3% tax on the sale of medical devices. And so just as an example, if you are a company that has billions in sales, you pay 2.3% on that billions. If you have sales of 100,000 with no profit, you still have the same 2.3% tax on 100,000, not based on profitability or income, it's based on revenue. So for many companies, that is a tremendous hardship in the United States. It is clearly a hardship we are one of the companies that has income, so at least in that perspective, that's good. But on the other hand, we've had to make decisions on employment and on R&D because of the device tax that we would not have made otherwise. And so there's no question the tax has had an impact on our R&D spending as well as on the number of people who are employed in the United States.
and you're shaking your head as well.
Yeah, ditto.
Just ditto.
Just ditto. I don't think there's anything I can add in terms of we pay tax on revenue and on inventory. It's not on margin and on profit. And that's tax that you pay. That's tax that you could use to hire people. That's tax you could use for innovation. So I completely agree.
And do you have any hope that it's going to be repealed?
I don't work in Washington as much.
That's right, you're the government guy.
We do, the government guy. I work for a private company.
I know.
So we will find out within the next 6 weeks whether or not the device tax will be delayed or suspended for some period of time. There's a bill that is likely to move forward, probably by December 11th, that will either have that repeal or suspension or won't. We're working very hard to, along with our friends at Philips, to make that happen.
Great. So I know that you all probably have lots of questions to ask, and so I will get out of the way and let you do that. We've got another half hour, and so we've got plenty of time to take some, but you have to ask hard questions. Okay. Who has a question?
So you were talking about the device taxes. By the way, thank you for the talk. The discussion was great. Where is that device tax going towards? What is it? What are they using it for? What is the government?
So the bill was that the provision was part of the Affordable Care Act. It was one of a number of policies. So the Affordable Care Act has 3 parts. Part 1 is creating a market and providing subsidies for the purchase of health insurance by people who don't have it. Part 2 was, that costs a lot of money, subsidies. Part 2 was cuts to providers and taxes like this to help offset the additional spending associated with that, those subsidies. And then the third part, which we also spent some time talking about, which was value-based care, ideas and experiments for how to change the way healthcare is paid for in the United States in order to try to promote improved quality and reduce costs. All right. So when that bill became law, or when that bill was going through Congress, it was important to the authors and many people who supported it that the dollars that were spent were offset by some other either reductions in spending or increases in taxes. Now, we can get into a long debate about whether or not there's a real offset there or not. I have an opinion, I worked in Congress for a long time and have a strong opinion about this, but that's the math.
Can I make a comment?
Yes,
Sorry,
please.
I'm Mike Fallon with Boston Scientific on the agenda a little bit later on. But that device tax, I think the general public doesn't realize that goes to the general treasury. I don't think that medtech industry would be as pushing back if it were truly within the operating budget, essentially of the Affordable Care Act. And there's a big disconnect in Washington because many of our representatives, certainly here in the state of Massachusetts, when the industry goes and says we think it's an unfair tax and it affects innovation and the ecosystem and all that, they say, yeah, but we don't want you guys to repeal we don't want you to repeal the Affordable Care Act. We're like, no, we want the Medtech tax taken away because it goes to the general treasury. So you don't really have control over what it can be used for. And that's a big disconnect.
Yeah, governmental budgetary, every tax goes to the general treasury. There's no special fund for this or for that.
Yes.
So I was talking to Jacques, I think, during lunch about this a bit. So a few years back,
Can you speak up just
a few years back, we ran a war game for a medical devices company. And their concern at the time was about a company called Intuitive, which was a robotics company, right? So this goes to the issue of price. It goes to the issue of the do more for less, evidence-based medicine that all of you are contending with. And I know it's an irony, whatever, they were selling a lot of these products. I think they still are. There was a billboard at Fenway Park, right at Fenway Park, describing some hospital that purchased this $1 million robot. And there were, at the time, if I recall, one of the biggest surgeries was prostate cancer. And it claims the robot does a better job executing on the surgery. And there was very little, or very tentative evidence, if I recall, for that argument. And of course, what was happening with the surgical instruments companies, the robot was going to sort of commoditize all their great instruments, and the robot was going to become the center of the surgical suite, in a sense. And they were selling to the CEO of the hospital, I guess, small hospitals wanted to buy these products. So the question I have is, there's the soft stuff that goes way beyond evidence-based medicine, which is who you're selling to in the company, and will that continue in this era of outcomes and evidence and more data needed? Will these, head trauma kind of devices that are being produced, I mean, how much evidence do you need to prove that? Or is it something the NFL will grab onto because it'll let them keep playing football? I mean, in all reality. So how much of this is a constant political discussion and cell discussion in a hospital? How much of it is really evidence-based medicine, especially on the big equipment that's trying to take over the hospital budget? Right?
Let me give a perspective, but not actually from my role at Philips, but when I was on faculty at the University of Pennsylvania. So I was on a committee called Pharmacy and Therapeutics. And actually, this is actually before 2000, just approaching up to 2000. And again, it was a large consolidated health system, so every pharma representative would come to the various people on the committee to pitch for their drug, because if it wasn't on the pen formulary in Delaware Valley, then it would be much less likely that an outlying hospital would use it. So for credibility, I'm going to say that there we actually had formal pharmacoeconomists. We did a lot of due diligence on that committee, looking at outcomes and papers, where it was published in journals, impact factor of the journal, was it multi-center, what was the quality of the study design. And if that's happened in pharma, I'm just extrapolating to say it's going to continue to happen in medical device. I can't see how it won't happen. It's not if, but just when and at what pace.
Well, most payers, large payers have technology assessment offices, and the only currency in those offices is just the peer-reviewed publications. They have a special scale of the quality of the study itself. Where it was published, just as was indicated.
But I think this purchase was a capital investment on the part of the hospital. I don't think it totally worked around. And
I think the days of being able to get reimbursement, which is the key element here, because without reimbursement, none of that would happen. The key element and the driver is indeed getting reimbursement, and that will only get harder.
But they would still get reimbursement for the procedure.
Yeah, I guess I would quibble a little bit with that. I think that there are several, one driver for purchasing equipment, whether it's an ICT or a CT or an MR machine, is what it can do for your business, or what it can do from a reimbursement perspective for your organization. So if I buy an ICD, what am I going to get back for that? For implanting that in a person? If it's an MR machine, how many times will it run a day? What's the reimbursement for inpatient MR? Another element that though I think in this maybe was playing into the robotic issue is hospitals market against each other for patients. Right. They do. And so that's especially in a place like Boston where you have really high-end locations and lots of hospitals probably struggling because they don't have the reputation of MGH or this, that, or the other. And so there are multiple reasons to do some of this. In fact, I think that whether it's Philips or GE or us or other imaging manufacturers or other diagnostics manufacturers, sometimes those products, if it's far enough, if it's cutting edge enough, are attractive enough to make the purchase not just about the reimbursement. And so I think both factors are important. However, also, that's going to be harder and harder and harder as we go forward, right? When it is becoming more difficult, there's less money, or there's more demand for fewer dollars. The rise in demand is bigger than the rise in the number of dollars available. And so that's going to cause constriction and make that kind of purchase, if it's for that reason, less valuable.
Yeah, so I'll build on that. So I agree with the quibble in the sense that, and I've seen it on the side of a bus, one hospital has a new piece of equipment and it comes to us. But just recently I was actually at a heart failure conference in Washington. Two big blockbuster products that have come out. One from Novartis, which is Entresto, which is the CEO of Entresto thinks it's to be a $5 billion market, $10 billion optimistically. And then another, St. Jude, is actually marketing a device called Coumans. And looking at the space, I actually went through what you were talking about, something called California Technology Assessment Forum and then ICER, which is the economics review. They're really boring into the stuff. And I see the buying of equipment in this more traditional one hospital versus the other, but it's going to start to go away because the long-term reimbursement won't sustain a drug or device that doesn't affect outcome. If they do, they're going to have to take it out of another discretionary budget, but it's not going to be reimbursed because of the care of the patient.
I'd like to add a different perspective from industry point of view. If you're in industry, you're building equipment, then usually you peg the R&D level to a specific percentage of your revenues, your sales revenues. You know, in the medical device industry, 7%, 8% are numbers that are being tossed around. If you want to advance, you maybe go to 11% investment. So those are traditional metrics, if you will. What is becoming more and more clear that we have to start budgeting for evidence generation. And that eats away or increases the budget that you have to set aside for developing new products. Now, going back to intuitive, if you look at the proof that is there for incontinence and impotence, there are other techniques developed in Canada for brachytherapy treatment of prostate tumors that have a far better record, but are less profitable and therefore have less interest by the hospital administration that wants to drive patients. So I think maybe this almost becomes a question about philosophy and ethics. Is it patient-centric, the care that we have?
I just would like to add too that when you're trying to break in with lower cost approaches and techniques, my sense is that the peer-reviewed science journal article is where almost all of the companies we're involved with, we focus on that. We try to figure out the right formula to get the right publications, the right thought leaders. And that typically is the first wave of investment. And then once that investment's made, you then very quickly move to the reimbursement. And there's a lot of, interestingly now, Cardinal Health, Blue Cross Blue Shield, they're actually at their own investment funds. And so they're actually now making investments in many of these companies that are actually fueling the peer-reviewed science journal articles. So I do think that is the beginning of an engine that ultimately might go up against the large capital purchases that were made historically, and those kind of infrastructure that wants to drive those purchases and get the returns on them. I think there's newer ways that are going to be trying to break through, but I think the science, peer-reviewed science journal articles are just paramount for small companies trying to break in with new tests.
So, it seems that because of the trend towards evidence-based, it becomes a marketing problem. So are the marketing departments at medical device companies sophisticated enough to be directing what needs to be included in a clinical trial or what needs to be included in a study? And I say this coming from marketing at Philips, so I'm just wondering, is that something that we're seeing as being included in business plans?
So it's a coincidence, but I went from R&D, and actually I ran the cardiology segment at Philips. So I had run the clinical trials, and so actually we just launched a product called Heart Model. So you asked about some of the trends. I think bringing analytics into imaging and into data is key. So this is something where the machine reads its own 3D echo. So I can only speak from my own personal experience that when I was working with the Marcom folks, very much we were in tune with the messaging, and I will add to that, as the clinical trial was being done, it has to be run outside of the company in terms of, it can be funded by the company, but the lead investigator and the statistics have to be done outside the company. Though we were in contact that once the trial was done and being submitted for peer review, we understood what was being submitted for the publication because we knew that the marketing actually had to be around the claim of the journal. So the answer is, and in pharma, I know that they do that. So the answer is moving forward more and more. It's going to be live and die by the journal paper, not just for the R&D, but for marketing. And as a doctor who is used to practice, that was the key. I mean, it was just live and die by what were the results of the paper. Not everybody's like that. You heard there are what I'll call more vanity buying in terms of various reasons, but the thing that's really strong is the vanity.
Having lived in GE and Philips and Analogic, answering your question directly, no, I do not think that marketing departments are strong enough to immediately from the get-go focus on the clinical peer-reviewed driven claims. So there's going to be a time that industry has to educate itself and bring medical specialists inside the company. So I'm interested in bringing clinical scientists, MDs, PhDs, MDs inside companies is actually more.
So I admit I was definitely a one-off.
I'd like to add to this point too, is that I've seen a strong trend towards the advanced science degrees in marketing. And it's exactly the point that he's making. It's these networks of KOLs, and how do you establish these networks of KOLs? And I think with the new social networking, most of these KOLs are actually LinkedIn now. And so the sophistication of marketing organizations is really more about the networking. And so anyone that brings that scientific credibility can extend their networks very rapidly. And so I do see a trend towards more, even on the science advisory boards, we see more MBAs being brought on with the PhDs because of that linkage and the need to market the science.
So I'm going to connect
That's
the
good
dot.
news.
Yeah, I want to connect the dot because you're right. So that a lot of the folks who worked in my marketing department didn't have medical degrees. So what I would say for folks who aspire getting the business degrees in pharma, to work in pharma or medical device, is to learn some of the basics about a clinical trial, epidemiology, some basics about statistics. You don't have to be a statistician. You do want to understand when a paper comes back, what is the business impact of that. So you just sparked a fire in my brain that if you're going to go in this area, learn something about it, learn what the difference is between a randomized controlled trial and an equivalency and so forth. Those things will be important.
So some kind of a joint science MBA degree is a good degree for the future,
I would definitely
that
say
kind
yes.
of background.
Well, so I run policy and government affairs at Siemens Healthcare, and two of the people on my team are MBAs. They bring the analytics and the business thinking to the table, but then they have to learn, okay, what's reimbursement mean? Who pays for that? And so they pick that up on the job, but they bring to the table the connection to our business, so what about government affairs if you can't understand its connection back to the customer and to us?
I see another interesting trend too on this topic is that many of the major KOLs that we're working with around the world
And KOL for people who don't
key
know.
opinion leaders that are private investigators pulling NIH funds for major grants to really bring in independent research that really isn't linked to any one company. That whole field, I find many of these KOLs, even here at Boston University, they're hiring MBAs in their programs to help them with outreach, to find the right kind of marketing programs and what they've got to help them better establish themselves. Even though I don't think they front that, but I see evidence that they're bringing them in for increased promotion of what their KOL center can do.
Okay.
And our selection criteria for finding KOLs is influenced by who not only has an MD or an PhD running a program, but who actually has an MBA. So very
Good, good
So
news.
that's an interesting maybe sentiment. MD, PhD, MBA.
Yeah,
I think
2 degrees to go.
one of Joe's sitting right here. He just didn't leave school for a while. Yes, question.
Just kind of following up on an earlier question. So I work for a spine and orthopedics company that's part of J&J, which is probably the fattest and slowest dinosaur out of all of them in terms of how quickly we come to market and how quickly
We're taping this.
That's okay, they know it, we all know it at my company. So I was just wondering if you guys could kind of comment on the opportunity for real innovation and real transformation, especially working in a big company, particularly in light of the reimbursement space. So for example, we have a huge healthcare economics team, we have a huge lobbying team, and I feel like we're kind of always in the struggle between chasing the codes that already exist and figuring out if there's an opportunity for if we build it, it will come. If we build that new technology and that new instrument or implant that will drive patients to all outpatient or all ASCs, if we build it, will it actually come? So I was just kind of wanting to get your thoughts.
So for Siemens, we've tended towards building it, hoping they come. Seriously, we pride ourselves on being an engineering company that is cutting edge. Now, maybe people would disagree with that. That's what we pride ourselves on. And I would argue, so for us, perhaps the balance is the other direction, or the imbalance is the other direction. We actually need to be thinking, so we have the engineering and the innovation side covered, at least it feels that way. But what we don't have is making sure that those really cool things that we've developed actually have a pathway to market in a way that's going to be useful, or at least useful from a revenue and income perspective. And so I spend a lot of my time over in Germany trying to convince people, you can't just make this cool thing. There's some other decisions you have to make, or at least information you have to be aware of that's going to make you, hopefully, consider your decision.
I think it's difficult for large established companies to carve out the resources necessary to think totally outside the box. And that's what you need in order to establish breakthroughs. Because most engineers and scientists are involved in the daily drudgery of improving this particular feature or that particular feature. And the company should be thinking in terms of, if we can allocate those resources, we may save in the long run on having to spend $300 million to buy something that we could spend $10 million on.
Yeah, so I was just going to reframe. So I agree with the panel. There are two things I would say. One is to have proactive thinking rather than reactive thinking. I think the way to have proactive thinking is to have groups of clinicians, engineers, MBAs, reimbursement experts looking forward, not saying, oh, we have to build a product for the code that just came out, but actually looking forward into where care is going. It's going to be tricky because not all the things are going to land, but definitely looking at the KOLs where basically what Wayne Gretzky says is, I skate where the puck is going to be is part of it. The other part of it is, again, on Clay Christensen, it's not depending on large teams to do things. Carving out small startups inside a large company, if that's the context where they can be agile, I think is key. So those would be my sort of summary points.
And I'd just like
If I-
go ahead.
Sorry. Just one more thought occurred to me that I think that chasing codes is not the right driver. The right driver is identifying clinical need. And if you are able to have resources that would be totally focused on identifying new needs and then allocating the resources in order to address those needs, the codes will come.
Kevin?
I was just going to add that, first of all, I think it's a great question because I do think innovation, once you're successful and you have a lot of infrastructure around that innovation, it's really hard to get out of the box and to truly innovate and do the things that you're describing. But most of the companies that are sitting here, as well as some of the ones that aren't, have parts of their company that are looking for acquisitions and looking for partnerships. And there's a lot of investments coming into these companies, like the ones I'm involved in, from these companies. And that could be another area of interest that you might, even J&J, I'm very aware of some of their programs. If you can migrate to some of those areas, you might get a better look-see at some of the ways that they could move innovation more rapidly by acquiring it in.
Yeah, I think if all else fails, J&J just buys it anyway, so that's kind of always the backup. So, thank you.
It adds an interesting phenomenon to the intercompany workings, because more traditionally you have engineers and they need to be guided to make something, and usually product managers do that. But that means that product management really needs to oversee all the trends, and they barely have the bandwidth to see what's happening in the innovation space of the startups. So the business development function of the company comes in almost on its own nickel and say, look at all these potential innovation assets that you could add to the company, which have nothing to do with the engineers that are already there.
So speaking of innovation, what are the coolest things that each of you have developed in the last year or so? What is a particularly cool thing?
I'm not sure I would be able to answer that. The coolest thing we've invented recently that's like brand new, it's actually a couple of years old, is our MR PET machine. You guys have one now too, I think. It's a brand new technology, actually pretty hard to do. At least we think it works. Pardon me?
For a while.
We can argue about whether or not which technology is better, shall we say? Anyway, it's an interesting new technology.
I would say two things. There was a time when I was at GE not too long ago. One of the coolest things that we developed was silent MRI.
So say more about
Silent
what they...
MRI. Well, I'm a physicist. MRI is loud. You are confined in this tunnel. It's not always kosher to be there. Your family is left behind. And then the only thing that you have to remember 10 years hence is this enormous power.
Mm-hmm.
And traditionally it has been thought that you can't avoid that. Well, actually, there's a family policy that you can implement with good image quality, good possibility for specificity and sensitivity and radiology is required, and you get nothing. So I think that's cool technology. And what I showed you before, this little handheld device, we're just scratching the surface. The real key is this thing here in the back. Ultrasound probes usually are arrays. This is a two-dimensional array. So one idea is to use this to find veins, but you could easily think about using this to glue to kids' heads and find out the pressure in intracranial vessels. So there are all kinds of nifty things possible with these handheld devices.
And you've got something.
I was going to show this is a Sony disc, and we actually have 24 samples on here, but there's these little beads that are like magic that can go into the blood, and they can find proteins that are at a level that no one even thought existed in the blood. And so we have the equivalent of being able to find a single grain of sand in 2,000 Olympic swimming pools, or finding one blade of grass in a field the size of Alaska. That's how specific this is. So 1 femtogram per ml. So everyone thought that the blood-brain barrier prevented a lot of these proteins from the brain and the spine to get into the blood. But we can measure them into the blood. And there's a lot of new publications. It's changing the way science is going to be practiced, because seeing these things at such small levels allows you to see proteins when people are healthy, as opposed to just seeing them when they're sick. And when you can see that gradient, it's going to change the way you do screens. So like troponin, you go to for a heart attack, you go to the emergency room with chest pains, they immediately take a blood test, they look for troponin. if in fact you've had a heart attack, the troponin level is at a level they can measure. We can measure it routinely on someone that's healthy, so annually. You could be looking at those troponin samples and see if there's any migration towards it versus cholesterol and other things that may not be as indicative. So the concept of being able to see things in blood that's magical, we think will revolutionize medicine.
So it's actually back to one of the very early points about identifying things early, and trying to do that.
Prevent the disease or get to it when it's still curable or treatable.
Yeah, actually, so I can speak to something I'm pretty proud of, having been involved both on the R&D and the business side. It was actually in the Philips quarterly earnings this week, and it's called Heart Model, and it's actually putting intelligence into the imaging system. So at Philips, we developed something called a 3D ultrasound many years ago. I think Siemens had one too recently.
That's
But anyway, I think the key is as medicine goes and there are more and more patients coming through, how can you scale to meet demand? And so this is actually having the machine now perform very fine quantification in heart failure. That's going to be important as you titrate drugs. You can see very small changes. You're hearing that on the panel. The ability to detect very small changes early in a disease process is important. And having the ability to scale, so putting analytics into the machine and so forth. But my closing comment is we're actually all friends on the panel. We're happy to be here.
And I didn't separate the two of you on purpose. Anything that you've seen that you think is remarkable?
Well, I would like to buck the trend, and rather than talk about more and more advanced technologies that are really focused on potentially improving the health of very developed economies. I would like just to illustrate some of the challenges in the third world. And one of those challenges that we've been involved with was an initiative by UNESCO to try and have an early diagnosis of pneumonia. And if I polled the audience on what do you think, if you can imagine a rural community in Africa trying to diagnose children with pediatric pneumonia, what would be the technology that you would use for that? I think that you would find it challenging if you don't have electricity and you don't have any imaging. So just to illustrate that, the accepted practice today is to count breath. And so the diagnostic device is a timer and a set of beads that are used in order to count the breath. And so if you can think of a device that would be more accurate and that would allow you to do such a diagnosis based on a simple scale of age and weight of the child, and you could manufacture that for a few cents, please see.
Is there such a thing?
No, there isn't. At least this is the challenge, and it's still on the table.
Well, thank you, our panel. This has been terrific. Really, really appreciate it. So thank you. Thank you all for coming. And we are going to reconvene in the auditorium at 10 of 4, correct? 3:50, 10 to 4 England, 10 of 4 here. But close to 4.
Yes, and potentially in that 20 minutes actually, please stop by your sponsor booth so that you can learn more from them. And also as a token of appreciation from the student body, we would like to meet the whole panelists. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for doing that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.